On this episode of the P&R Churchman, I have a return guest, but he will probably be new to most of you because it's probably been 2 years since I had him on. This is ruling elder M.D. Perkins. M.D., good to have you on again.
Good to be with you, George.
Thanks. Yeah, so you are, I always forget your title because you're an author, you're a videographer, you're a production guy, but you work for the American Family Association, which has a long history and heritage here in the United States, so we want to learn all about that. But what is your title with the AFA?
Well, I do video production. I'm also a research fellow of church and culture, which is where I ended up researching the book that I wrote, Dangerous Affirmation, that we talked about last time.
That's right. And so the last time I spoke to you, I know you were on. I might have been introduced to you through Presbycast, and when we were in the midst of the Side B discussions, you had a very timely book you wrote, and it's pretty weighty. I'm trying to see when it was actually published. There's a lot of
2022, I think, is when it came out.
Yeah, so you were right on the front end of some of the discussions, because what you were researching, 2020, 2021 then?
Yeah, I mean, my research goes back to 2019 is when I started it. And but nothing was published until later.
Because of Revoice in 2018?
It was absolutely because of Revoice, yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's a thick book. It's not sort of a, I wouldn't consider it, I could be wrong in this, but I wouldn't consider it like a pastoral, like this is what you give to somebody who's in the struggle. Like there's some books like Becket Cook's is great, A Change of Affection, for instance. But this is more like how we got here and why it's wrong. Right?
Yeah, it's confronting many of the lies and the issues underneath, connects in some of the political and social issues. And I mean, there's a number of questions that it answers. And it presents in a compact form, the biblical case for why we believe what we believe, as well as trying to decipher how that is counteracted within the LGBT movement and the gay affirming church, as well as the Side B issue. And because all of that, I mean, that book came out of some additional research that I did in a paper called A Little Leaven, confronting the ideology of the Revoice movement. You can go to afa.net/a-little-leaven to find that. That's a free PDF download, also an audiobook. I think it's up on Audible as well. But that paper dealt in depth with the Side B Revoice issue. All of that came out of just trying to understand what people were even saying. What were the actual arguments that guys like Wesley Hill and Nate Collins were making, and how do we deal with what they were saying? So at first it was just trying to understand what they were even saying, and then second to that, it was trying to understand how do we combat this? Why is this wrong, or what are they saying? So.
Yeah, I think so I'm on the page now, and I'm pretty sure I had listened to it, because you do have like an audio recording of the different chapters of this paper. So I do commend it to everyone. We just kind of jumped right in, which is what I like to do. But we are going to be talking about the culture war in this new documentary you made about your founder, Culture Warrior. And so we'll get into that, because I think there's been such a backlash against the terminology of culture war, and yet that's what you chose to name this documentary. And like I said, we'll talk about that. And so as we get into all this stuff, first I want to ask you, and you shared with me that your brother's family lost their home in the California fires?
Yeah, my brother and his wife and their daughter live in Pasadena. And they were in an area that isn't normally under wildfire threat. I mean, Pasadena doesn't normally get those threats, but the way that the winds were blowing and everything kind of progressed pretty quickly. So the Pasadena and Altadena area of Los Angeles were highly affected, along with the Pacific Palisades and some other communities around there.
Wow. And so you went out there, right?
Yeah, my dad and my sister and I all went out there to help them sort through some stuff, itemize things that they had lost, just try and be there, help them support them as they're trying to make kind of quick decisions about relocating and even just juggling donations and things that were coming in from neighbors and local friends in the area. And
So where'd you stay? Like, how would you even do that?
well, we were able to get a hotel room in kind of the middle of Pasadena at the Hilton there, which was, you could tell it was clearly packed out with people from the area that had been displaced, as well as a number of firefighters from other parts of California, as well as Las Vegas. I could see Clark County, Nevada, firefighters there as well. So yeah, it was a packed out location, but that was kind of also an additional hub in the community for a number of donations, and they were using their conference rooms for local meetings and town halls and things like that too.
Wow, you were right in the thick of it. And so, anything else you want to share on that? I mean, I know this is not like not meant to like shine the spotlight onto onto your personal tragedy, your brother's, but I know people are curious about it. Like, what was it like there? And
well, I would say that it was very weighty. Driving up to the house, their ruins there, because of course, like, there's the personal connection, so you know what you're going to see when you get there. But as we're driving up Lake Avenue, driving north, and you're looking along the side of the road, and there's the Pasadena Job Center, and it's just flooded with people outside of it. Maybe it normally is, but it just, in this context, it definitely jumped out. And then you look across the street, and there's a donation center in this parking lot. There's a donation center in this other parking lot. And then there's a line of people with a tent set up receiving some kind of aid or food or something. And then there's a line of National Guard vehicles, probably 20 or so coming out from that area as you're going in. And, and you're pulling up to the site, and you're just seeing the devastation around you, and how, I mean, there's a randomness to fire and fire damage that is just really kind of off-putting and unsettling, because you're driving up the street, and it just looks like a normal neighborhood, like everything looks fine, and then you get halfway down it, and then you're seeing fire damage. And then the house across the street from my brother's house, that was, I mean, down to just ashes and, like, just a few sticks sticking up. But then their house, it was destroyed, but the walls were standing, but the roof was completely caved in. And, so, I mean, everything was still utterly destroyed, even though from the surface you drive up and you're like, okay, it doesn't look as bad, but then you look in the window and it's gone. So
how did the fire on your brother's house go out? Were there firefighters there?
There were
firefighters.
Yes, the firefighters were able to get to the area, and they had some attentive neighbors, and really their life was spared because of the neighbor directly beside them, who was knocking on windows and doors that morning around 5:30, and they were able to. They had already loaded up their car just under the threat and paying attention to things. But I mean, you're talking about the fire moved from the mountains 3 miles into the city in the span of 12 hours. And just, it's crazy how quickly it moved. And even though there were evacuation notices in a number of different neighborhoods, their house, the embers were kind of picked up by the wind and moved over to their neighborhood, but ahead of any evacuation notice. So they were out like 30 minutes before there was even an actual evacuation notice for their neighborhood, just because the fire moved so rapidly.
Wow. So what did the neighbor saw the fire on the roof before the family, or what?
Well, he saw across the street that the house over there was completely consumed in flames, and so he was getting out, and then he was telling as many people as he could up and down the street to take cover or to flee.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, man, thanks for sharing that. I was you and I were talking about doing this episode, and then you shared that back in January, and I prayed for you, prayed for your brother, and I'll just
appreciate it.
Yeah, I was just like, I don't know if impressed is that's not the right word, but you don't know what emotion you're feeling. But I was proud. I guess proud. I was proud of you, bro.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a lot of experience with hurricanes. I'm from South Florida, and so
right.
Yeah, I know very well about like mobilizing for family and friends, and then even here in North Carolina, we've done some disaster trips. So Yeah. Okay. Wait. Are they? I mean, they're okay physically.
Yes, physically they were fine. It was just the contents of the house were destroyed. One of the cars was gone, and lots of tools. And this was a house that they were building as their forever home, and
Mm.
so my brother's. Very much a handyman, takes after my dad. I don't take over this part of my dad, but so I'm not very handy around the house. But my brother, he's was redoing all the different rooms of the house, and so they were just kind of building it as they went along, making it what they wanted it to be. So, it wasn't just a short-term rental or something. I mean, there was a lot of personal effort that had gone into the place, and along with all the stuff. I mean, obviously we can say that things are just things and you can replace them, and of course that's true, but when you think about the things that you have, they're acquired over the course of your life, and they have different levels of significance to you based on experiences and people that you knew and things like that. So yeah, while they are just things and you can replace them, they aren't just immediately go to the store and get everything back and it's the same.
No, totally. I mean, in a totally like not as significant way, but my dad has smoked cigars my entire life, and he always had this ashtray, and it was this like clear glass, very heavy, large ashtray. And the last time I was at their house in Florida, I was like, "Where's that ashtray?" They broke it, and he was like heartbroken, and I was more heartbroken than him because
Yeah.
not that it was a particular nice piece, and I
Right.
mean, I have a cigar here and there. I don't smoke in the house, but just there's this sense that reminds me
Sure.
my dad. My dad's still with us, but like I was like scouring the internet and I found them on eBay, like these things from like the 60s,
Yeah.
and I'm waiting to get it. But I know what you mean. It's not because of the value of it, but there's a sentimental thing, and yeah, we are physical people who connect with things physically. So
Yeah, I mean it is just stuff, but at the same time, there are these pieces of our history and our personal development, and reminds us of different times and different people and different experiences that we had. Just going through my brother's, talking through his closet, he's like, "Oh, I bought this shirt when my wife and I were on our honeymoon. Oh, I got this is a friend's band that doesn't exist anymore." And just going through all these different, they're just T-shirts, but they remind you of all these experiences from your life. So there is a loss there that's you recognize it's not the same as human life, but it still hurts. I mean, there still is a loss.
yeah, yeah. In January, I lost my uncle, who's he was 85, but he was my godfather. I was a Catholic. And so I was looking for pictures of him, and I found a picture of me when I was like maybe 5 or 6 years old. I was on his lap, and I had this Mickey Mouse back scratcher in my hand. And it brought me back to my childhood that I
Yeah.
had this thing probably until I was a teenager, and I broke it. But then it dawned on me, oh, he gave it to me. He was a big Disney guy for whatever reason. And, again, like I was like starting to be sad I didn't have that thing anymore, that
Yeah.
remembrance of him. And I hadn't thought about it for so long. So, yeah, it is, I guess it's a picture of the fall, like fire is disordering and destruction. And,
Yeah.
we're called to bring beauty and order. And so when, it's like the reverse of what we're supposed to be subduing, and it instead nature is subduing, and it's
Yeah.
disheartening.
I was already reading Ecclesiastes to start off the year, and then with all of these things hitting, and as I'm flying out there, that the vanity of these things was really, hitting, but also, I mean, the admonitions to kind of enjoy the things, the good gifts that God has given as well. So there was that kind of dual reflection there that was happening for me, going out there.
Yeah, I bet it's jarring too, because it like you realize how precious life is, and as much as property gets damaged, life is more precious, and so there's this tension between the loss you feel but the gratitude.
Yeah. Well, and for them, they kind of, it's easy to struggle and to have an element of guilt when people are giving you things, and you're able to get quickly reestablished into a new house, and it's in the same school district that your daughter was in before, so she's not going to be completely disrupted from some of these normal things. And then you're seeing that there's other people who aren't in that same situation, and so you start to feel bad about taking the gifts that people are giving and the charity that they're extending to you, but you also know that receiving that charity is part of what's is a good thing for the other person who's giving it. And so there's a whole slew of mixed emotions that people are going through in the midst of these situations. So it gave me a kind of a fuller perspective, I think, on that.
Wow. It is emotional overload. Wow. When one of the disaster trips I led from our church after the hurricane in western North Carolina, we with M&A went to this one church, or actually this one pastor's property, and it didn't sustain the kind of damage you might have seen on TV, and the pastor felt guilty that we were there helping them.
Right.
And just in hindsight, the idea, like, this guy was nonstop 24 hours a day at that point, like 2 or 3 weeks, tending to the needs of the congregation, and nobody is really able to help him. And here we come and we help him, and he felt so unworthy of it. But that's what our Father in heaven does. It's not like God prioritizes the needs and says, well, you're on the end of the list, Yeah. So yeah, it's good to process through that. And again, let it turn our hearts to gratitude. So are they staying in California at this time, or?
Yeah, and they're hoping to rebuild at the house property. They love their neighborhood, they love this area, and they've been building up roots over the last decade that they've been there. So yeah, they're hoping to be able to rebuild. And I don't know how that looks in California, with building regulations and codes. And I mean, I've heard from a contractor that it can take 18 to 24 months just to get permitted to do certain rebuild projects and stuff in the area. So
yeah, I saw that on the news. That's they're going to need to put some emergency things in place to deal with that.
Hopefully they will, since there's such a great need. But I mean, even then, resources are going to get limited, contractors are going to get limited, workers are going to be fewer and far between. So
right, or people are going to be leaving.
Yeah,
I mean, like the places that I've seen, particularly in Florida, that have been completely devastated by hurricanes, a year and a half later, there's still some evidence. You'll see some brush piles and some junk piles and but like for the most part, it's almost this new, like out of the ashes comes all this new, But of course, Florida, which actually has very strong building regulations because of hurricanes, but the red tape is not what it is in other places, and other places are going to need to kind of take note of that.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this conversation went a completely different direction. It's going to be, I think that was a good 20 minutes right there. And I'm going to probably put that in the title of the episode. So it's going to be really jarring, because it's going to be like California, aftermath of California wildfires / culture warrior. And they're going to have nothing to do with each other.
Right.
But the reason we're on again is, again, you're a ruling elder, and I like to highlight what ruling elders are doing, and whether it has to do with the church or not, but this actually has to do with the church. But it's not polity stuff or, insider baseball stuff for the PCA. Like I know there's a lot of podcasts doing that. I'm doing less of that because there's guys doing a good job of it. But it's this was significant. So you turned me on to this documentary you made called Culture Warrior, and I got the email, and I think I got it the day I had double hernia surgery. So I was laid up. I was going to be, basically in my house in a chair for a week. And I was like, well, cool. I got something to watch now besides, whatever else. And so I was able to watch it, and I jotted some notes down. But then over a month has gone by at this point, and so hopefully I do remember quite a bit of what I would want to talk about. But I know the fires that happened, you were going out for the fires. I had the death again of my uncle, and now here we are a month later. So let's talk about it. Tell me first a little bit about the American Family Association, and then we'll get to the movie.
Right. Well, it's hard to talk about the American Family Association without talking about its founder, Don Wildman, because Don was a Methodist minister in Mississippi, and in 1977 started what was called at that point the National Federation for Decency. And Don's whole story begins with sitting down to watch TV one night in 1976 in the holiday Christmas season, and the only three networks on TV, and there's a scene of sexuality on one thing, and profanity on another, and then this intense act of violence on another, and he's sitting down to watch TV with his family, decides to just turn it off, and is kind of overwhelmed, I would say, at where things have come as a culture, his complacency, I think, within it as well, and just the impact of television as a mass medium on his parishioners, on his children, on the friends of his children, on society as a whole. And so that was what began this organization that is now called American Family Association. They changed their name in 1988 from the National Federation for Decency, NFD, to AFA. And so it's a pro-family organization that's been around since the late 70s, and it's focused on a number of different culture war battlefronts, from network television to issues of pornography proliferation, especially among convenience stores in the 80s. But, even now, there's the pornography issue is something that we're still finding ways in the current context to combat. The anti-Christian bias in media, from depictions of Christians and Christian doctrines such as the Last Temptation of Christ. That was a big campaign that AFA was involved in the late 80s with that movie. And just the homosexual agenda and the ways in which corporations have become complicit, not only complicit, but really, promoters really of the LGBT insanity that's happening. I mean, going all the way back to the mid to late 90s on a lot of that stuff. And then American Family also began a radio network, the American Family Radio Network, there in the early 1990s, and there's nearly 200 stations around the country, and a lot of it is talk focused, talking through issues, cultural commentary, kind of weighing with a Christian worldview mindset, how do we think about the things that are happening in society and in politics and in culture. So AFA wears a number of different hats, and if you watch the movie Culture Warrior, you'll see Don wore a number of different hats as well. He saw things a little bit differently than I think a lot of people did, and made certain connections that are still kind of interwoven into the way that the ministry operates today, where there's a number of different departments that focus on different aspects of culture war issues, but it's all trying to inform and equip and activate people to stand up and speak out on a lot of these things and to be aware of what's going on.
Yeah. And I want to get to, I'm sure a lot of listeners are listening and thinking, well, I thought we're against the culture war. And so I want to get to some of your thoughts on that. But just to talk a little bit about or jump in on a little bit of what you just shared and the documentary, I was fascinated by a lot of this because so I'm 50 now, and more in life, I'm seeing like the undercurrents of things that have happened over the last 50 years as people reflect on them. And it's like, oh, I lived through that.
Yeah.
And I was a product of that. I was swimming in the water of that, but I didn't know what was influencing those things, And that's what I was finding with this Culture Warrior video and Don Wildman. I never heard the name before. I grew up Catholic, but I did have a Protestant influence in my family. My grandparents had converted, I guess in the 70s, and a number of aunts and uncles, but our family was still Catholic. So I was always kind of hearing a little bit of that world, and I very much remember like the 7-Eleven boycotts.
Okay.
Because I remember I wanted to go get a slushie and suddenly I wasn't allowed to. It was just like, what are you talking about, Mom?
Right.
Well, they're selling magazines and we take for granted. But I remember as a child in regular supermarkets. I'm not talking about convenience stores where they're selling cigarettes and beer and everything's at your hands, and of course they have pornography. I'm talking
Right.
about Publix,
Mm-hmm.
and and at child level, eye level, pornography right there. And sometimes they would have something blocking, so you would just see the title of the magazine,
Right.
Penthouse or Playboy or Hustler, and then there would be like a panel blocking the cover of it. But you don't see that anymore.
Right.
And so to maybe, and again, I don't want to quite get there yet because I want to talk more about the experiential side of this, but to maybe some of that, well, does this really work? Objection. You got to remember what it was like in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I'm old enough now, I can remember seeing that everywhere. So much to the extent that, like, I would want to go to magazine racks in, again, drugstores like a CVS or Walgreens or a Publix, Winn-Dixie we had in Florida, and I wasn't allowed to go pick out a sports magazine because of what was right there at eye level.
Wow. Yeah.
So I was like, and then it's like this, ooh, there's bad stuff and you're not allowed, and
Right.
that creates, maybe curiosity too. And,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, I think we forget about those things. Now, pornography is so insidious because it's right in your pocket. I mean, you don't have to like make a scene now and go buy
Right.
something in a store or walk into a triple X store. I remember seeing them all over the corners. I don't know if they even
Sure.
still exist. Because you get it online. And so, like, yeah, it is insidious. The other thing I remember is the big backlash against The Last Temptation of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was fascinated as I watched this that really the AFA, or at the time the National Federation of Decency, and Don, like, they were the ones that were starting these things. Is that so? Was it just them, or were guys like Dobson and like did these guys align on things? Because I did a search, I didn't see any sort of overlap with Dobson and Don.
I mean, they're friends and co-belligerents, in the war, but it wasn't like. But they had distinct ministries and would sometimes join the stage at certain times together. But I mean, Don knew of kind of the other big guys out there that were confronting a lot of the cultural forces. He knew Jerry Falwell and D. James Kennedy and James Dobson and the LaHaye's and all, kind of those big names of evangelicalism at the time. And but in terms of AFA was, I guess Don's mindset with it was always a boots on the ground approach. Like he always wanted to lead people to action and to help people to stand up and to speak out and make a difference. And so that's really what Culture Warrior, the documentary Don Wildman and the Battle for Decency, is about, which, by the way, you can go to culturewarrior.movie and watch that for free. I'm sure you'll have a link to it on the video itself.
Where is it on the AFA? Because I'll pull up right now. Where is it on the AFA website? That's where I'm at.
Go to culturewarrior.movie is the website that you can watch the movie through that. So there may be a link on the AFA website, but if you go to culturewarrior.movie, that's where you can go to watch the movie for free online.
Yeah. So actually, it is so right from the main website.
There you go.
You can learn more. So you can go to afa.net. You can find the American Family Radio, which has its own website, but it'll take you there. And then Culture Warrior Movie has its own culturewarrior.movie. So you can watch it there. I guess that must be where I watched it.
Yeah, that would be. And there's DVDs and stuff as well if people are interested still in physical media. I know some people still prefer that. But I guess what's interesting about Don and, is this quality of the public witness, I think is what you're getting at here with the culture wars, because you're talking about not just a personal conviction and something that's just between you and your family and maybe a few friends and maybe even your local church, but the idea of going out and speaking more directly to somebody else involved and getting other people to take notice. I mean, there's an uncomfortable aspect to doing that, right? Because suddenly we have to know whether we're taking the right stand or not. So there is an element of accountability on us of what is this stand really worth talking about? Is this really worth trying to, because you're going to have to defend your position, and there's a confrontation that's inherent just within that speaking out on it. And but also, the value of the public witness is that it allows, there's an opportunity for the person or the organization or the company that's doing something that you have a question about to respond. And that was Don's point. Like, you could, if you're going into this grocery store and they have pornographic magazines, like, you could choose a different grocery store or go somewhere else. But if you just do that for yourself, you've given them no opportunity to potentially change course on this. And what he would note time and time again is that very often the managers of these stores didn't necessarily want what was being handed to them to sell, but they had to do it. And if they received a complaint, then maybe they could pull it. But they had to receive a complaint. And what he often found is that there were many cases where no complaint had been given. It's not that nobody didn't have a complaint. I mean, people were frustrated about it, but they just kind of held that to themselves and never spoke out about it. So when you think about even the fact that you can walk into grocery stores now and there aren't Playboys and Penthouses all over the magazine shelves, it's not just that didn't organically happen through culture over time as people moved away from magazines or they found pornography in different ways. That was very specifically the result of Christians and other concerned citizens standing up and speaking out on this and applying pressure. You had to apply pressure in some cases, actually threaten to boycott or go through with a boycott in order to get companies to take you seriously, because, they're just concerned about the bottom line. But if you could make it clear that the bottom line is still involved here, then sometimes they could respond and take you a little more seriously on those questions.
Right.
And so that's what Culture Warrior is about. It's about that whole history, like you were describing, this whole genesis of the pro-family movement going back to the 70s and 80s, and why did Christians get involved on these issues, and what was the thinking behind it? Because this is the story about Don and AFA, but even if you don't know anything about Don, I think you'll still connect with this and understand, because they'll have memories like you. Like, I remember when people were talking about this, or I remember when my family did this, and I never fully understood why. This gives you the context behind so many of those culture war battles. The boycott against Disney in the 90s that the Southern Baptists even jumped in on, but that was spearheaded by AFA. A lot of these different cultural flashpoint moments, people may remember pieces of them, or they remember the idea that something happened here, but they didn't ever hear the actual reasoning and logic behind it, because it was all filtered through the media's delivery and their twist on why people were doing this and things too.
And I thought you did a great job of highlighting that through his own words. I mean, one thing I was impressed with the video is you have so much firsthand video footage, documentation of his interviews, it was a lot of media that you were able to draw from, which was amazing from the 70s and 80s to have that breadth of media and to hear it from his own words, because I think the moral majority, the culture war thing gets cast as we're trying to legislate morality and we're trying to put on this moralism and it's legalistic, whatever else, And
right.
When you hear his heart as he's explaining it, he speaks about the worldview that undergirds it, and he does address it the way we would address it today. Like, this is just the fruit of a worldview that is corrosive, and we don't even realize it's in play. And that's what I mean. Like, you just swim in the water, you don't even realize what you're accepting.
Absolutely.
So he was concerned about the worldview. And what I think is interesting is, like, you take a guy like Francis Schaeffer, who is associated with the moral majority, but again, like the way I always describe him is like he's like this hippie that had a commune in Switzerland, and somehow he becomes a part of the moral majority, and so he's this weird dichotomy of not the typical moral majority looking guy, Schaeffer, right? But when you read Christian Manifesto, that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying that the humanistic, materialistic worldview is corrosive, and it leaves victims in its wake.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's interesting to critique the movement on this side of it. But even then, when Schaeffer wrote that in 1979 or 80 or 81, he says, if you don't agree with us, okay, then do it better and differently. But we need to do something. And what I was impressed with from Don, again, never having heard of him, although I've heard of the AFA, was he had a church, what seemed to be to me maybe a small Methodist church in a small town. It seemed like, again, from the video, and he just felt burdened, and not simply for like, there's sin going on, we got to crush the sin, but like, what is this doing to us? And he would say, what is television doing to us? And if you fast forward to today, I mean, as a pastor, this is what is internet and social media doing to us?
Right.
And like, people are glued to these things, and I am too. Like the first thing I do when I get up in the morning is like, I've had to train myself to thank the Lord and pray before I pick the phone up.
Right. Spiritual disciplines.
It is. It's like
the spiritual discipline of putting down the cell phone.
Of putting it down in a way, and how it's reprogramming humanity.
Right.
And he was saying that back, and so I think there was some forward thinking there. But I think on this side of it, it's almost like people want to trash the whole project.
Yeah.
All of it, all the moral majority religious right stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's an easy target, I guess, for some people because, I mean, it's been characterized, frankly, a certain way in the media. And so, to poke holes in it or just to call it fundamentalists or fundamentalism. I mean, Don said, you call me a fundamentalist. I mean, I'm a United Methodist. By definition, I cannot be a fundamentalist. I mean, the idea was not I'm removing myself from culture, but I'm trying to participate in these things, but also recognizing as a Christian, I see the ways that this is harmful to my neighbor, and I want to draw attention to that, and I want to get people to think about this. And so it was really kind of a common grace aspect of his ministry, was trying to draw people to the bigger issues, because the NFD initially, I mean, we are a Christian ministry. Obviously, we're founded on Christian principles. We're started by a pastor, and theology matters to us. It's not irrelevant, but at the same time, his campaign was something that he was trying to point out that this is something that anybody, because we know internally, like they were created by God, and they have a moral sensibility, and they have a desire to maintain a moral, orderly, decent society for themselves and for their children. And so therefore you can appeal at this common grace level and hopefully find compatriots in other areas where you might not expect. And that's what he found. I mean, on some of these TV shows, there was an interview he did with Tom Snyder where he's going at it with Lee Rich, who was a producer. I don't remember if it was Dallas or Starsky and Hutch, but one of these big TV shows in the 70s. And Lee Rich is making his case for why he could put as much sex in it as he could possibly get away with, and why that was good, because that's what the people wanted, and how he didn't have to have any responsibility for this, because that's kind of on them, as to if they mistreat sex or they have wrong views or whatever, that's on everybody who's watching. But Don was saying, well, why wouldn't you want to construct people in a better way of thinking about things rather than just giving them the lowest common denominator? And he ends up getting Tom Snyder on his side, the host of the show, be kind of a classical liberal, to agree with him and kind of be against Lee Rich. So, I mean, there were these opportunities because he was willing to stand up and speak out and take a stand and allow himself to even be made fun of, to be the bad guy. I'm constantly throughout the process of making this documentary just impressed by his boldness and courage and the ability to have thick skin enough to let people say things about you that you didn't feel like you had to go out and debunk, because there would often be times where he would say, yeah, they're going to twist this in the media, but at the same time, anyone who's really cares about this issue, if they read what's being said there, they can tell that this is a misrepresentation or that this is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by his willingness to speak with all these people, the publishers of the pornography themselves, the television network executives. And one interesting thing that occurred to me, and then he said it as part of one of the discussions, is it's almost like they view him as a country bumpkin. I mean, he had a thick accent, he had a simplicity about him, but he wasn't simple. I mean, I can tell, very forward thinking, very brilliant, but he didn't care. Again, he didn't have maybe the swagger of a Francis Schaeffer trying to deal with these things. He was more just down to earth. But what I love about it is, like, first it seemed like to me it started, look, Christians, we need to be questioning this stuff for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, again, 3 channels. And I even remember that. Like, I should tell my kids, I don't think I've ever told them. Like, we used to have to get up and turn the dial on the TV because we had some old ones in the late 70s, early 80s. And, my dad called the remote the chick or the clicker, because they used to make, they were physical buttons that would make noises. But yeah, you had like 3 channels, And so, like you said, I don't remember if it was, what was it? Was it sex? Was it violence? And it was something else. And it's like, wow, man, there's no option here. And these are public stations. And it turned from like, well, Christians, we need to think about this and let's just shut it off, because what is this doing to our minds? To then realizing, man, at that point, the country was like 80% Christian, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So why are we even putting up with this? Like if television executives and media producers they care about their bottom line, who has more purchasing power than those who claim Christ? And I remember him saying that. They're like, well, this is, the guy says, well, this is what the people want.
Right. And
he's like, well, yeah, but you only have 20% of the market share. Like, why don't you want the other 80,
Yeah, the reality of the Nielsen ratings, which is only, with that 20 share, that's only 20% of the country is watching it. The other 80% are not watching at all. But that's the 20% that dictates that if this show is successful, then there's more shows like it.
Yeah, I was just picking numbers out of the air, but I thought it was about right. But yeah, that's exactly right. So that's the tyranny of the minority view. So the other thing I think was impressed upon me was, even if you don't like the methodology of things like boycotts and the culture war, what he did when he came along, and I'm assuming this, is he helped. He was one of those in the group of, I don't know, maybe 20 in the country that pioneered having Christian media.
Mm-hmm.
With the radio station, for instance, and other things, because the point is, okay, you don't like what's on the television stations or the radio, have it for Christians, and that's received a bad rap. But come on, I mean, I'm glad there are Christian schools and Christian organizations and Christian radio to listen to, and the like.
Yeah.
We live in a day when we're not limited to 3 channels on a dial. I mean, we have. Anybody can have a TV station now at this point. Anybody can stream stuff, and of course, the internet opens the door up to just even guys like me.
Yeah.
So we're not limited in that way. So what? Tell me about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What was the impact of some of the media they were producing? So they went from rallying people around. Well, it seems like they started off with awareness. Then they started off with advocacy. I mean, then they went to like advocacy and mobilization, but then they went to media. So is that a fair?
Yeah, that's a fair generalization of the trajectory of AFA, because I think nowadays, even though activism and awareness are still a major part of what we're doing, a lot of that comes through our media outlets. And so, Don, having such an emphasis on television for a while, he was subscribed to all the broadcasting magazines. So he was reading when new changes were being made by the FCC regarding broadcast licenses and things like that in the late 80s. And so when he caught wind that there was a way that you could create these you could have basically these repeater stations where you had one hub that was sending out the broadcast, and then that could be repeated in these different places. He suddenly realized that this was a fascinating opportunity for Christians to lay hold of something in order to control the media that they were talking about, because Don was constantly frustrated. He knew how to use the media. He used it well. But at the same time, the more that AFA would have success in the culture, often that would always be treated a certain way in the media, or ignored at certain times, or not brought up. And so, he was constantly frustrated at how he was misrepresented. There's a special feature we have on the DVD that talks about how he was interviewed by Time magazine, and they had a quote from him that was wrong, and he corrected it. And then when the magazine came out, it still had the wrong quote in it, even though he was assured by the publisher that it wasn't going to be, that it was going to be changed to the accurate quote. And at some point he was just like, I'm done with this. I can't win for losing with these guys. And so being able to create, I mean, and that was kind of a radical idea. I mean, he talks about that, presenting that idea to the board, and there's several of those original board members who we were able to interview for this, who talk about him saying, we're going to start a radio station in Tupelo, Mississippi, and then from that we're going to build out a radio network. But one of the things he would always say is that these are our microphones, so we control them. We get to say what's on them and what isn't on them. Whereas if you are interviewed, you're at the mercy of the editor or the broadcaster to represent what you said accurately, and then to even present that to the public. And however they want to do it, they're going to do it their way. But, just kind of recognizing the secular humanist mindset, worldview that was infused in everything. And that's a major aspect of the documentary. So to be able to speak about these things, allows you to talk about in depth the ways that you'd like to talk about it, rather than just the soundbite kind of things that get picked up by the news, and to be able to explain in detail why you're doing this thing or what your thinking is behind it, and to help Christians think about this from a little bit different perspective, because that was another aspect of Don's approach to boycotts, is that you could boycott something and maybe have an impact there, but there's an additional impact, which is people starting to take this issue seriously and think about it because you put a threat of a boycott behind it. It's like when that stuff happened with Bud Light, not too long ago, about Dylan Mulvaney. I guess that was like 2 years ago. AFA wasn't involved in that. That wasn't ours. But to mention boycott Bud Light, suddenly people are talking about the issues of what is Bud Light doing? Who are they getting as sponsors? Who are people? There's this whole kind of behind the scenes network of people trying to get LGBTQ endorsements and all these kinds of things. Suddenly it brought these issues up in a way that just talking about it or kind of being dismissive over what they had done just didn't really gain the attention.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this is trying to kind of treat it in like binary forms, like the boycott worked or it didn't work. But what
Right.
you're raising, I do think, is public perception and awareness. And so you can, like, a certain boycott may fail.
Right.
So what is this? Like you lost the battle, but you win the war kind of thing. But I think people grow weary though. There's always a new thing to be angry about and boycott. And I think the other concern many have is because we are no longer a Christian nation, and I'm not saying that in the fact that like we were officially established as, I'm not going to get into those kind of debates, but we were 80% or more Christian. Now we are not. So in that sense, we don't have the critical mass that we have as far as like what biblical Christianity is. Like the boycotts have been and are being used against Christians. Mm-hmm. So there is a sense that, I don't know the full history of it, but Christians seem to start the boycotts around whatever issue it was. In South Florida, by the way, it was the 2 Live crew. I don't know. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah. I could have included it because that was connected with Don as well.
Oh my gosh. I remember because I don't remember if it was the 80s, and
Yeah.
Luther Campbell and Two Live Crew, this rap group,
Mm-hmm.
they were big also with University of Miami. So University of Miami football was, at its peak in those, 80s and 90s years. And then Two Live Crew. And I remember they did a song because it was Sheriff. I mean, how do I remember a sheriff from like the 80s? Sheriff Navarro, of all things. Because he was in a song and everybody's singing this song with expletives about this the sheriff because he was shutting down their stuff. And, I always remember this stuff. It just, by the way, when we've gone off any script we may have had, but the other funny one to me is, back in the day when you'd rent videos from, movie stores, Blockbuster, wherever, and you're always in my home, my cousin's homes, you're renting movies and there may be a scene in it that the parents might want to fast forward or something, but that was also in the day where the jokes were the dads didn't know how to use the VCRs. That was always the joke. And so I heard my dad and my uncle complaining, joking really one day about how a scene comes on. You're watching a movie with your kids and the mom is somewhere in the house and the movie's been fine. There's nothing on it. But the one time they walk through the room, there's a flash of a topless woman or somebody pops out of a cake. And it was that's not what the movie, and they can't even jump for the remote quick enough. And the wife starts going nuts on them. And so my uncle dubbed my aunt and my mother the Legion of Decency because they would, and now I know where it came from. The National Federation of Decency. My whole life I always joked about my mom as the Legion of Decency in our house.
You didn't realize, George, how interwoven you were with the history of AFA in this
I feel like I know Don. Have you ever met him?
I did get to meet him. Yeah, he was alive while we were working on the documentary, and then he passed in December of 2023. But he had dementia, Lewy body dementia, and so he wasn't able to be interviewed for this. But as you pointed out, finding all of these archival clips of him speaking in his prime at that time, with the concern fresh on his heart and mind, was way better, honestly, in my opinion, than being able to sit down with him late in life and have him try and remember and reflect on some of those things. So in God's providence, that's how it worked out. But I got to meet him a little bit, and it's funny because I didn't realize this really. I mean, it came back to me, but I grew up, a baseball's throw away from where he lived. And here in Tupelo. So I knew my parents got the AFA Journal, and I remember listening to American Family Radio as we're driving to school in those early days. And one of the radio hosts who's still here at the ministry, was on the air, JJ Jasper. And, so I have all these little connections, and the church that Don pastored and the church that he pastored when he was in Tupelo, that when they moved back to Tupelo to start the ministry, he wasn't a pastor anymore, but he was still at this church, Lee Acres Methodist Church, which is just 2 blocks away from the church that I serve in now, Lawndale Presbyterian. So it's just it's all kind of, Tupelo isn't that small, but it feels that small when I started working on this documentary, because I had all of these little connections to Don and his family, and we knew a lot of the same people, and so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, well that's great. One thing I appreciated too was just how the ministry went on without him. He transitioned it well, and you guys you've moved on. So.
Well, that's because it wasn't just about Don making a name for himself. So this was never the Don Wildman International Ministries or anything like that. I mean, it was, he always was very matter of fact about it. He was as long as Christians are concerned about these causes that we're talking about, then we can continue to operate, because they'll continue to donate and allow us to do the work that we do. But if there's no longer any concern, then we'll shut our doors and go do whatever else the Lord has for us to do. So, he was speaking that way back in the early 80s when literally, I've looked at some of the books. There was a time where he wasn't sure if, there was $100 in the bank account, and he's not even sure how he can how he's going to be able to send out his newsletter the next month, and those kinds of stories. So it's just, it's one of those things. I think the integrity of the leadership here at AFA is something that I've constantly been impressed with. I've been here for 10 years. I didn't come in here, just to speak frankly with you, I didn't come in fully on board in the culture war kind of mindset. I came in here primarily because I have a professional experience in filmmaking and television production, and I needed a job in the town where I was living in. And so, but by being here and learning more about the ministry and working on the projects that we've worked on, and also going through some of the stuff, I wrote Dangerous Affirmation. That was such good preparatory work for working on this documentary, because, to put the amount of research that I did into that book and to try and understand the issue in the same way that Don was trying to understand the issue, the ins and outs of it. How do I speak about this? How do I confront the, this opposition or this question that might come up? And then to release something and then essentially have a lot of people not really care about it or feel like, well, maybe you're kind of making too much about this. Personally, on the experiential side, it was good for me to kind of feel what Don felt in a way. And so to have even to work on that book, I think was part of this, helping me understand who Don was, how AFA functions, how do we deal with a lot of these cultural issues, and learn to just kind of continue to put our foot to our head to the plow and do the thing that we need to do, because God has called us to do it, and he hasn't called us to be successful. He's called us to be faithful. That's a quote that Don said that gets shared a lot here at the ministry. It's not just
I've heard that. I never knew where it originated.
I mean, it may have originated somewhere else, but it was really a life motto for Don, and it's something that is it is in the fabric of everything that we do here at AFA. And so even though we're not a Presbyterian or Reformed, it's a broadly evangelical group. I work with a lot of different Christians from different parts of God's kingdom. And so it's actually enriching in that way to get that kind of fresh interaction with different people outside of my normal circles. But that commitment that I want to be faithful to the Lord and leave the success, whatever that looks like, in his hands, because ultimately it's his battle. It's not mine. I'm just a shepherd here. I'm just stewarding these things. I'm trying to be faithful as best I can. And so
and thank you for that. I think, some people that say, well, I don't want to be a culture warrior and I'm against the culture war. We are in a culture war. Christians can disagree about how to fight the war, but you can't ignore that we are in a culture war. There are different worldviews at play.
Right.
The kingdom of God is not the kingdom of this world.
Yep.
We have the armor of God. I mean, the scripture says this in so many different ways without using the word culture and war, but describes it as a war. And Christians are constantly called to be on guard for worldly and vain philosophies. And, Ephesians 5 says, have no parts of the works of darkness, expose them, do not participate in them. And one thing I've been so concerned is with Christians that have rejected this idea that we are in a culture war because they don't want to, either offend or because it's been done wrong by so many. And we have to acknowledge that there's been a lot of people acting in very unchristian ways in the name of Christianity. And so we can call that out. But what they've done is they've adopted the worldview and mechanisms of the world. And even, I know tons of Christians that have marched in pride parades, and you ask them about this and they say, well, I don't agree with, I know it's a sin what they're doing, but I'm trying to show them I love them. And I'm like, no, you don't make people think their worldview is right. That is not loving them.
Right.
And so I think Christians have gotten lazy. And, I'll go back to Francis Schaeffer. If you don't agree with how those guys have chosen to highlight this, do it better.
Yeah.
Do it a different way. But the idea that we can, that there isn't this war going on already, it is going on. Don even talked about that, about the TV. He goes, it's not simply ignoring Christians, it's anti-Christian. And there's no other group that you couldn't be, anti a certain race or anti-Semitic, for instance, and I know that people make arguments that things are, but like it's totally fine and acceptable and applauded to be anti-Christian. And he was like, so it is going on, and we need to be aware. And even if whoever's listening to this, if you're like, that's not what the church is for, that's not what the gospel's for, and okay, you don't want to do that outward facing. Can you at least uphold within the church and the covenant community that we are not to participate in the evil works of darkness, but we are to expose them, at least in the covenant community? Can we actually be a different people than what is being exhibited around us? So anyway, that's my plea. Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was well stated. One of the big, what I think is the heart of the documentary really is this whole section that's talking about secular humanism, and it's talking about the idea of the culture wars as spiritual warfare, that there is a spiritual assault on the hearts and minds and thinking of men, women, and children in this nation. And, this has its roots in, in the fall and Satan's attack.
And all through Scripture. I mean, what did Nebuchadnezzar do when he takes, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he tries to evaporate their culture and engross them in Babylonian culture?
Right. I mean, you have these flashpoints where the spiritual war takes on material form, where you can actually start to see some of the battle lines clearly, which is why these issues of life and the question of abortion and homosexuality, why these are such hotly debated issues. It's not just because people have opinions and they're really tightly held and all this. This strikes at a spiritual issue, and these are spiritual forces that are at work here. So, it gave me a deeper appreciation. I'm trying to say for the nature of this battle, which is something that I understood, or I was starting to understood, I should say, more clearly as I was working on this sexuality research. But then you start to see it played out in these other social arenas and political arenas and different aspects of culture and society. And I mean, there's no other way to deal with it. Like there is a spiritual attack that's happening there. And so some cognizance of that, some awareness of that, some desire to combat that or deal with that, whether that's on the front lines or whether that's behind the scenes, trying to shore people up with right Christian thinking. How do we think about these things? How do we sort through, discernment issues? How do we think about how we spend our time in entertainment and all these different things? Because we are being discipled constantly by the world through a host of different platforms. And how do we make sense of these things and think rightly about it? I mean, that's a massive job. And so it takes Christians on all different parts and pieces of this battle in order to try and make any headway. But the Lord's called us to be here and to do what we can with the time that we're given. So that's what we're going to try and do.
Yeah, thanks, MD. And so for everybody, again, it's afa.net, and from there you can access the Culture Warrior movie, the radio station, the articles they write, and see how this organization continues to try to shine the light of Christ in their own way. And so thanks for listening to the P&R Churchman. This is Pastor George signing off.
I've been wrestling with going to seminary for years. I had so often thought that me going to seminary would look like me uplifting my family from where we lived and where we ministered to go to another city, another school across the country. But when the opportunity came to pursue that while still being plugged into my local church, it was just a tremendous blessing.
For over 50 years, BTS has been providing a biblically faithful, affordable, quality education to students wherever they are. And that's one of the reasons why I really love the BTS model, and I'm excited about the introduction of the Reader Center for Pastoral Studies.
As someone who has had the opportunity to be impacted by Pastor Reader, I look at the Reader Center as an opportunity for others now to be impacted by him, even if they didn't get a chance to sit under his ministry. because the Reader Center will focus on Pastor Reader's core principles, which is not necessarily about him. I think ultimately brings glory to God, but to have a seminary education that is focused and centered around those core principles will only benefit them in ministry, and I think will really lay the foundation in a lot of ways for their future ministry.
I work full-time, 52 hours a week as a firefighter. I'm also the chaplain at the fire department. I have 2 boys, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and a wonderful wife. I'm also a pastoral intern at Grace Presbyterian, and the most exciting things in my life as I've been discerning this call to ministry have been the opportunities to minister and to serve at the local church, the opportunities to minister and serve at the fire department.
Just as Paul told Timothy to follow him as he followed Christ, Pastor Reader was that mentor to me, saying, follow me as I follow Christ. And those are big footsteps to walk in. And I think about those footsteps often here. I have journals with notes from him. I have journals with seminary notes, mentoring notes, staff meeting notes. So to have a place where a lot of that would be compiled together so that others can learn from a master craftsman, so to speak. They can learn from the wisdom that he passed on. Hopefully they will take that as well and be spread all over the world as pastors, correctly handling God's Word. Not preaching as the culture commands, but as the Word of God commands us to.
If you are privileged with the opportunity to be able to study at the Reader Center under BTS, I think it's a no-brainer for anybody pursuing pastoral ministry. I think BTS is honestly the future of seminary. I think in the way BTS is designed, in a lot of ways, they are creating a blueprint for what really all seminaries should eventually adopt going forward.
I started my seminary journey and realized how expensive seminary can be. And so when I came across BTS that was offering classes at such an affordable price and was still offering something that was just as theologically rigorous, it was really a no-brainer. It is affordable, it's accessible, and it's easily applicable to whatever you're doing in a ministry context.
The fact that I'm able to be present makes all the difference. And this seminary has been one that has allowed me to have that presence.
The Reader Center is going to give us an entirely new layer at BTS, giving opportunities to students through scholarships and research assistantships to be deeply engaged in the preparation of Dr. Reader's legacy content for future generations to come. The opportunity to participate in conferences locally that we put on, bringing pastors and scholars in to speak on pastoral ministry and training. If you're looking for the place that you think will train you for the rest of your life, we think that BTS is it. We have a legacy of 3 amazing pastors and many more that have been involved who lived their lives fully poured out for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And our goal is to train you so that you can live a life of service for our risen King.